G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic Friday, at least better than mine. I forgot to put out my bins today and they get picked up on a Friday. I heard the truck, I didn't make it. Damn. But I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and as always, we have a lot to go over. And we actually do have a lot to go over today. So we need to look at the maps. I need to show you a lot of geolocations and footage to do with those maps. We'll look at some losses. We need to talk about at length how the US presidency and how Trump coming in is changing things in Europe, how it will change things in Ukraine, and what Putin has said about this, and some realizations that then the EU is having. I also want to talk about potential insurgencies, and then I want to break down at length a speech that Putin made at an event, and I want to talk about red lines and escalation to do with other areas of the world and other fingers that Russia has in pies. And I believe that is all very important in this war. It is very, very important on this war to zoom in. We zoom in on a village and, there's a Ukrainian troop moving here, the border's moved this way, or there's a Russian troop here, the border's moved that way. But then it's very, very important, and this is where I think a lot of people don't do, because it is complex, is zoom out and go, why is X happening? Why is Y worried about the delivery of this system to Ukraine? Why wouldn't it be delivered? And then you see, Russia's launching satellites into space for Iran. This is all interconnected. So we'll talk about all of that at length, and great, that's what we're going to get to. So where I want to start is this. I actually want to start at what I believe I'm calling the EU realisation. The people in these positions, of course, should have seen coming from a mile away, but took advantage of it. So look, let's start with this. Ursula von der Leyen. Europe has to take more responsibility. I think that Europe had to take more responsibility a long time ago for our security and our defence. Yes, that's your security and your defence, and for supporting Ukraine. These are issues of mutual interest with the US. We will build on it. At the same time, we have a compass, and our future is in our hands. And this has been the great realisation of Europe not expecting a Trump victory. But what I will say, Europe milked the fuck out of cheap Russian energy, their oil and gas, while they were sitting there daydreaming about solar farms and fucking wind turbines that have not backfilled that at all. It's why it is so expensive. And they have also, while dreaming about this, have been able to because of the protection of the US. People saw this coming a long time ago. And if you don't believe me, let's just look at some comments that Donald Trump made when he was in office last time.
It's very sad when Germany makes a massive oil and gas deal with Russia, where you're supposed to be guarding against Russia, and Germany goes out and pays billions and billions of dollars a year to Russia. So we're protecting Germany, we're protecting France, we're protecting all of these countries, and then numerous of the countries go out and make a pipeline deal with Russia.
So exactly things like this. And what I will say is some of this is now coming home to roost, and we can see a little bit of panic and meltdown in some other areas of the world. At the end of the day, your security is your security, and the amount that you fund into these alliances is incredibly important also, and a lot of countries not making that 2% promised deal into NATO as well. Now, this can go one of two ways. There's one good way for Russia and a bad way for Russia. What this then does is Europe sort of gets off sitting on its hands and goes, fuck, this is important. We need to have a sovereign, really secure borders and militaries and industry, and bolster that alliance and their military power and industrial sector internally. Or it goes the other way and it creates division and it weakens alliances like NATO. Now, if you asked me right here and now, which way do I believe it's going? I believe at the moment it's actually looking like this is weakening NATO because of the division between maybe the progressive Western Europe and more conservative Eastern Europe, to do with a whole bunch of other issues, everything from migration to Ukraine to everything in between. So what we have seen is that Putin has congratulated Donald Trump. This is being reported by the Associated Press. He talks about the attempt on his life, and Putin said it left an impression on me. He manifested himself in a very correct way, bravely as a man. He also said what he said about the desire to restore relations with Russia to help end the Ukrainian crisis, in my opinion, deserves attention at least. So there will be some level of talks between Putin and Trump about the Ukrainian crisis. The Kremlin earlier welcomed Trump's claim that he could negotiate an end to the conflict in 24 hours. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate him on his election as President of the United States of America. I don't know what will happen now. I have no idea. So it'll be very interesting in the next coming days, next coming weeks, what sort of starts coming out of these official channels around discussions between Putin and Trump and Zelensky, see if there is some level of negotiation. But Zelensky has hit back a little bit on this, of course not naming, but we know what it's about. It is irresponsible to propose a ceasefire in Ukraine without providing our country with real, effective security guarantees. Now, what this will be meaning is back onto his victory plan, speaking about the promise of NATO entry. Talk of a ceasefire is dangerous when there are no security guarantees for Ukraine. Clear, real ones that we can trust, not merely rhetorical assurances. Such a ceasefire prepares the ground for continued occupation of Ukraine and the destruction of our independence and sovereignty. So what Ukraine and Zelensky has spoken about is if there is a ceasefire, Russia will just start recovering the military and they will invade for then a third time and likely have more success on that with the lessons learned and industrial capacity. The president noted that such proposals come from those who have not experienced war and understand its consequences and risks, saying a simple ceasefire is a model we are hearing about from some leaders here. So, of course, he's in Budapest at the moment. From Brazil and China, they have their own 6-point peace plan. And importantly, we are definitely hearing it from Russia. That said, my counter to this will be, okay, but we're not seeing the willingness coming from Ukraine either to not need a ceasefire to implement victory on the battlefield through mass mobilization of soldiers or wins on the battlefield at this point. And this is what I want to go into with, of course, visor to the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Mikhailo Podolyak. He has any realistic and effective plan to end the war begins with a basic axiom. The aggressor must fully pay the bills, legally, financially, and in fact, the aggressor cannot be incentivized to continue its aggression by significant concessions to it, so that it would get more land or this or that. Formalized right into impunity and acquisition of foreign territory. Otherwise, the conflict will only grow, and the aggressor will become more brazen, bloodthirsty, and happy to scale up the murders. But that said, for this to happen, for Russia to pay the bills in legal terms, in money, everything, of, the arrest of Putin, of his senior command, to pay back in the hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars, Russia would need to be pushed back and concede. And what steps are being done to stop Ukraine losing and start winning? What steps are being done, first and foremost, by Ukraine? Well, we can see there's not the willingness to mobilise the amount of men that I believe are needed, which would be, I believe, at minimum 500,000, if that is even possible, if that can. And there's not a willingness by the West to actually further weaponise and train Ukraine and those men, and the policy for longer strikes also. So this is nice rhetoric, but without a clear, decisive victory, that is where it will remain, is words on paper or words on Twitter. Russia is not about to hand over Putin and trillions of dollars while they are objectively winning this war. I think the next coming weeks will be very interesting to see what happens in Europe and what happens in Ukraine. But this could be the best thing to happen to Europe. For so long, Europe has been reliant on Russian energy, which it should never have been completely reliant on Russian energy, so on third party, and it's been completely reliant on US security, so third party. Now, yes, it may have had a very easy time for that. Lowered defense spending, lowered industry, and of course, cheap energy, but that has left in the situation where it is and could sort of get off your hands and go, oh shit, we actually need to focus on this. And long term could actually be very beneficial having a Trump presidency, because these countries need to start looking internally themselves and to their close allies. This is something that I saw by the Lviv Journal that I wanted to speak about as well. Even if Zelensky would be forced by Trump to accept defeat, the armed forces of Ukraine will continue fighting. Ukraine's fate is in the hands of the Ukrainian people, not in Trump's or Zelensky's. This is what I say about plebiscites or votes as well, though, is that Ukraine's fate should be in the hands of the Ukrainian people, and there should be fair democratic votes to a plebiscite regarding if it is a continuation of X, Y, or Z, but there should be that to see what the will of the people is. Also, like a Ukrainian commander said, if the West stops military aid, we will turn into an insurgent army. So this is something that I will say is an interesting point, and I've brought it up before, and many people said I'm a mad conspiracist talking about it, but this could really happen. Insurgencies are insanely hard to counter. The counterinsurgency operations, your coin, that is unbelievably difficult. Look at where the Soviets lost in Afghan, the Americans and the Australians and the coalition lost in Afghan, and look at a whole wide range of these. It would be very difficult for Russia to counter that. But furthermore, it would undermine further support, at least publicly on the books. It would undermine further support to Ukraine. If there was a large level insurgent army, things like NATO and the EU would be out of the question for that time being. And what I have said is, shit, if that occurred, we may see some Ukrainian forces that are under Zelensky or some NATO forces have to actually deploy in if these units undermine the entry into Europe or NATO or whatever other alliances. So there's going to be a big problem there, fighting on the battle, making more ground, or jeopardizing abilities to enter these institutions. That's very, very difficult. Now, what I believe there will be a level of insurgency, but I don't believe it'll be in Ukraine or occupied territories. It is actually very interesting that we haven't seen really any of this on scale in occupied territories, at least on the pro-Ukraine side. We have seen, of course, the Russian-backed militias from 2014 to 2022. So I'm surprised we haven't seen more of that. But this also can be a byproduct of this attritional grinding forward that the Russian forces are doing, rather than a maneuver. Is you're grinding forward and people either withdraw or have been killed. You don't end up with a large amount of people then behind the line. So that has been an interesting bit too. But what I believe is, if we see a level of insurgency like this, it won't be done in Ukraine, and it probably would be done by a third party, just like we've seen in some of the Sahel countries, countries part of the Sahel Alliance, where we see like targeting of Wagner PMC troops there, that we presume at least Ukraine had some ability then training or arming some of the militias that fought back against that. That's very likely how this will occur, just like how there was no hot war in the Cold War. But was there fighting there? Absolutely. Look at Vietnam and look at Afghanistan, where countries, third parties, then backed in support on that. So I believe we will likely see that when this war ends in Ukraine and Russia, it will just move into a third sector somewhere else, not under the original flags of targeting of Russian forces in maybe Syria or maybe somewhere in Africa or whatever. So I think that is highly likely as well. So we will see. Now, it does seem Fighter Bomber has put up that a Kar-52 Russian attack helicopter has gone down. So the commander, the pilot, has been killed, but the navigator has been injured. Unsure if they ejected or landing. Unsure exactly what has occurred there. Now, before we get into the really complex part of this around multipolar worlds, icebreakers, escalations, we'll have a look at the map and have a look at where things are changing. So, of course, here we have Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, what I'm going to show you is just yesterday's update, and then we'll compare today's update with Syriac maps. So what we can see yesterday is more ground being made by the Russian forces to the north of Vuhledar and Maksimivka. So keep that in mind for later on in the video. And as well, more ground being made to the west out from Seledov and Tushkerne as well in the direction of Zoria. Of course, broadening this area in here, sort of making this more of a salient and where Kurkov is sitting. I have had someone say Kurkov, the loss of this area could be so much, maybe we'll see a throw in the towel there, but we will wait and see. We've heard rhetoric like that for years. And just a small advancement in the center of Toretsk as well. Now what we're going to do is then step up to today, and this is where we will then compare these maps. So we see more ground being made around Maksimivka in this south region. So let's have a look. Now, I don't have a map that shows exactly on this area here by Syriac, but if we come along, we see Katanivka and Antonivka here, and this is where I want to show you some geolocated footage. So we look at this geolocation here, just at the end of this reservoir, down the road that is sitting right around here outside of grey zone. Now, this is definitely not grey zone because what we see, Jesus, that was loud. What we see here is a Russian armoured convoy moving down this road in this area and then having a armoured assault in here and further fighting. If you want to watch that at length, it is on the Telegram. So definitely an advancement of red and grey zone in here, and I believe this grey zone down in here would very definitely be red. So we have two Antonivka updates in here. Russian army captured 60% of the locality, said by Syriac map, really showing right up where we saw that armoured assault occurring. And then we have a second update just to the south. So this is the reservoir we spoke about. So to the southwest, out from this red dot being Bodyani, we see that there was a Russian advancement, which actually lines up with what we saw yesterday in this front too. So that is being confirmed across then both maps and some geolocated movements also. Now let's just move to Kurkov, just the north of here a little bit, and Ilininka. Now, one thing I want to say is it gets confusing because you have Ilininka here, which is under active fighting now, but you also have Ilininka sitting just out from Antonivka, which there is a fighting, I'm guessing, coming to fairly soon, or at least a lot of shelling. So that can get confusing because two areas, both getting fought over at the moment, that are named the same thing. So we have the Kurkov front. Now, let's have a look at a geolocation off the bat. So if you have a look at where I've done this, it's right just on the corner, right around here. What we can see is that Russia has raised a flag in this area confirming the advancement here, because there are some maps that do question how far west Russia has moved in this front. Now, remember, what we believe Russia is trying to do is get on the northern side of this reservoir of the Kurkov reservoir, of course, of the Volcha, and have fire control down to the south over Kurkov. But this negates a lot of the defensive lines that sit in here and the further support up to the north in the Tushkerne, Push, and Zoria at the moment. Also, if you look at the fortifications, it tells us a very similar story. But what we can see here by Syriac, Russian army captured the Ukrainian army's fortifications north and west of Stepanivka and entered the northern part of Ilinka. So they're saying the northern part of Ilininka here has been captured as well, and pushing further up, so right up to about here where my cursor is, that is what Syriac is saying, where the Russians have moved further. Now, I want to show you another thing just down in Vuhledar because I did forget. So this Vodiane push where we showed there was advancement in this direction yesterday by this map, I want to show you where there was another large armoured assault by the Russian forces. So we have Vuhledar and we have just out in here. So right on where this grey zone is at the moment, we had another large Russian armoured assault. Now remember, something that is the most interesting about this is being told for some time that Russia is incapable of conducting armoured assaults. That has been disproven because it never ended, and we can still see not only are we seeing armoured assaults, we're seeing an increase in the amount of armoured assaults being conducted by Russia also, like down here in Vodiane. Now, what we can look at in Pokrovsk, sort of front line here, two areas where Russia is making ground of Novoselivskaya and in the direction out from Novomitrivkaya as well by Deep State map. And we have two updates in here. So Surak is showing a large westerly push towards Zoria by the Russian forces, and then a second map update here, which of course includes that, and it is showing similar direction because this red dot is this Novomitrivkaya down here towards Zoria, and a further push out towards Yurivkaya as well. So these are actually fairly close in here, and of course is confirming that there is definitely movement in this direction. Now, before we move north, I want to come down south, and of course we have the Robotny front and Kopani. Now, if you remember 2 or 3 days ago, Surak was saying that Russia made an advancement to the north of Kopani, but no other map was showing that. Well, he's saying, again, that there is further Russian advancement again in the direction north of Kopani or northeast of this Nestoryanka as well. So out in these areas. Now, the best way to do this, and it's not the greatest, but we see where this like triangle paddock is and this long skinny one down in here, that he is suggesting that the Russians have got something, I believe, like this in here. That's very, very rough. Maybe more so, like that. So that is what he's showing. But if true, that is suggesting that Russia is pushing on another sector of the front line, which would fit into how attritional warfare is fought, pushing on many different sectors. Now, today, of course, what we see is just a small sliver made to the north out from Osheretne, which we haven't seen a push on this front line for some time by this map. But we just need to push up a little bit further, and then we come to Seversk, Vimimkia front, where we have seen some grey zone shift in here, some other maps showing the capture of Spurny, but a big claim by Surak saying that Vimimkia has come under Russian control. Surak is saying simultaneously with re-entry into Ivano-Daranivkia, which is then in here, which is what Noel reports, a Ukrainian blogger reporter said the other day had been captured as well, so lining up with Surak, the Russian army managed to capture the settlement of Vimimkia. So if we just have a look at where this train railway is running, that he's saying right out to about, see where it doglegs out to the northwest, that he's saying all the way up into here. But again, we will wait and see. Now, we are going to push further into the north. No changes shown on this map in Pishani front line here. But you can see where it is showing grey zone on this map around this tree line, like a blob here, that Surak is showing that the Russian forces have gained control in this front line and most of the locality that is sitting here. Now, I want to go north even further and talk about Kursk. So, of course, here we have Kursk. It's not loading for me, but it doesn't show any changes anyway in here. Now, one thing we have seen as far as a change recently is in the beginning, Russia really didn't use FAB glide bombs in Kursk because of the massive damage to infrastructure that, of course, sits within their own border. But what we are seeing a lot recently is that Russia has greatly increased their use of FAB glide bombs, and this is a FAB 3000 being dropped here in Kursk. And you can see the size of this explosion and potential secondaries here as well, or potential of maybe dropped with other munitions, but I believe a secondary maybe, or maybe one plane dropped a 3K, one dropped some 250s. There's a lot of claims of bombs being 3000s, but this gives a good idea of how big a 3000 actually is. So let's then talk further about Kursk. So Deep State here has said the enemy started a new wave of offensive operations in Kursk. The day seemed difficult for the units, the defense forces in Kursk. The enemy resumed offensive action, so Russia is pushing back. Of course, the Russians will not stop there and will try again and again to carry out mass assaults with newly arrived units. So saying that more Russian soldiers have been mobilized to be in here and try and push back the Ukrainian forces. Now, of course, Commander Sursky has posted this on his Telegram. In May of this year, intelligence confirmed the enemy's plan to attack the Sumy direction from the Kursk region to create a so-called buffer zone in the north of Ukraine, like Russia did in Kharkiv. This was supposed to be a continuation of the Russian operation in the Kharkiv direction. That is why it was decided to conduct offensive operations to overtake the transfer of hostilities to the territory of the enemy in the Kursk region. So you preemptively go in. What I pushed back on this was, though, is that Russia was incredibly unprepared and it took them weeks to get the amount of soldiers or armour or vehicles into here to counter that. What doesn't exactly mean that they were prepared for an offensive operation right in this direction. They had to bring guys from all over the country and some areas off front line to come into here. So it doesn't exactly scream that to me, if that makes sense. I believe that Kursk is the biggest mistake of this entire war by either side, and that there's trying to sort of justify the operation and how it's jeopardising other areas of the front, and could jeopardise a hell of a lot. For almost 3 months of the operation, as of November the 5th, the losses of the enemy in the Kursk direction in terms of personnel amounted to 20,000. You can see the claims of liquidated, wounded and captured. During the same period, he claims over 1,100 units of enemy weapons and military equipment were destroyed. He says now Russia wants Ukrainian troops to withdraw from this territory. Now there are a lot of rumours that Ukraine is getting ready to withdraw from Kursk. Now, I believe militarily that's probably the best decision. It probably would have been a better decision weeks ago once the momentum stopped and it just grinded into attritional there, protracted there too. But there are a lot of rumours about that, and this may be setting the groundwork for, between Deep State and this, we see how Russia's deploying more and more soldiers in, that if there is a withdrawal out of there, it can be blamed on that, not of, hey, this was a mistake, we need to rip out. The enemy concentrated there about 45,000 soldiers, but one thing I will say, if Russia has concentrated 45,000 there and still advancing in the south, the east, in the north, in multiple fronts, that is a bad sign also, and tries to increase their number of Russians' own troops and not enough for this direction. So they're trying to attract troops from North Korea there. Now, some Ukrainian officials and accounts are saying that North Korean troops are already being targeted. We really don't know. The Russian occupiers wanted to seize more territories in the north of Ukraine, the Sumy region. However, the Defence Force of Ukraine took a preemptive step and continued to destroy the enemy on its territory. So linking back into paragraph number 1 and the buffer zone. About 2,000 Ukrainian servicemen are awarded state awards for heroism and successful actions during the Kursk operation. So what do you think? Do you think that that Russia is planning a large offensive in here, or that as the colder weather comes, as Russia is dropping more fabs here, and the willingness to drop them on their own infrastructure, that we will see a withdrawal out of here, but laying the groundwork for, well, Russia's put in 40,000 troops into this area, we've had to, have a tactical withdrawal out of here, not, shit, we could really use these soldiers in Pokrovsk or Kharkiv or Robotny or New York Toretsk. Again, I'll leave that up to you to decide and history to tell us. So let's talk about a speech that Putin made and icebreakers, unipolar worlds, red lines, a little bit of everything. And this may be confusing, but I believe this is incredibly important. That zoom in and zoom out that is necessary. So let's start here. This was on the Kremlin website, a ceremony for the Chutka nuclear icebreaker. So this is the 5th project Quad 2.0 nuclear-powered vessel that is being launched. These nuclear icebreakers are the world's largest, most powerful vessels designed to ensure year-round navigation in the Arctic. That is really important. These are far more powerful than diesel icebreakers. Diesel icebreakers, there's actually very, very few diesel icebreakers. Russia has the largest fleet of icebreakers and the only country to operate nuclear icebreakers in the world. That is very important for a point in a second. It should be also noted that China is put as a near Arctic power, that they are also developing their own icebreakers, working with some nuclear Russian propulsion companies too. The nuclear icebreaker, the one I'm seeing launched, the Chutka, will be the fourth serial icebreaker built under this project. One icebreaker was built before that series had been launched. 2 more ships of the same class, the Yakutia and the Leningrad, are under construction at the Baltic shipyard. Next year, as agreed, icebreaker Stalingrad of the same series should be laid down. In addition, the next generation nuclear icebreaker leader, the most powerful so far, is being built in Zvezda shipyard in the Far East. Now, it talks about the construction of this. It's just propaganda, whatever, trying to, it shows our industrial power and this and that. But it is important to say Russia is the world leader in nuclear propulsion with icebreakers, and some will say, and this not war, is the leader in some nuclear energy and propulsion as well, because there hasn't been a move away from that to green stuff in Russia, that they have continued just developing that with their engineers, and China and Russia are working together and developing this too in that base as well. Putin has said, I would like to repeat that our plans to develop our Arctic territories and increase cargo traffic along the North Sea route, the NSR, rely on expanding Russia's icebreaker fleet. One thing we have seen in the previous years is Russia has implemented some of the most strict environmental laws or maritime laws around environment issues and emissions in the world in the Arctic. Now, when you think Russia, you don't think Greenpeace. You think oil, gas, uranium, titanium, crude coming out of the bloody ground. But what this is for is so they keep a monopoly on the ships operating in the icebreakers up there. They're the only ones that operate nuclear icebreakers. Therefore, these emissions laws have come in that they're that strict that you could basically not operate a diesel icebreaker in there, and the diesel icebreakers don't have the power to operate year round. And also part of that too is it would take, I've seen people say, from 3 decades to 5 decades to get a capability of nuclear icebreakers fully operational in a Western state. That's just what I've seen, but I'm unsure on that. Thoroughly preparing and comprehensively discussing all aspects of advanced development of the North Sea route. So from Asia to Europe, you basically have 3 ways to go. You go through the Suez Canal, you can go down around Africa, which is significantly longer, or the third option, not spoken about as much, is you go up over the top. You go through the North Sea route. Now, the North Sea route is the shortest of these by kilometres and days. That reduces, of course, your the fuel that your ship is using. It reduces the salaries you're paying the guys. It means you can have more ships go because it's faster turnaround. Shorter days means a lot. This is why the Houthis are incredibly powerful in the world. As far as, they're just a group out there with some jet ski engines and some bombs and some anti-ship stuff, but they're having a massive effect globally, because if they are making ships, or insurance companies have to pay more money to go through Suez or go a much longer way down around Africa, that has a huge global economic effect. Now, what I will say is the Houthis, of course, are a proxy of Iran. Iran, of course, is working in ties with Russia and expanding and increasing cooperation there also. Therefore, it is in the interest of Russia, I believe, for the Houthis to hit some of these ships, and instead of going around through the Suez and paying more insurance, or going around Africa and paying for a lot more fuel and a lot longer time, that the North Sea route looks far more attractive to these private companies. We need to consider options to create a more efficient pricing model for icebreaker freight transport. So you have to pay, of course, for one of these to take you through, so that more carriers and shippers can afford such services, especially since both Russia and foreign companies are showing more and more interest in this route with each passing year. I wonder why. And I'm sure this interest will only grow. Talks about upgrading the infrastructure of Arctic ports and building the necessary railway routes to them too. So really pushing it, this is where it wants to go. And of course, any ships moving from Asia to Europe are going to have to pay some level of taxes and transport fees and all through here, but these new icebreakers should be able to keep that North Sea route open all year round. And that's where I think the Houthis come into this, all this comes in. That's why we need to have a zoom out on some, I guess, worldwide geopolitics and where the US may be going, ooh, or not wanting to deliver something, not because there's going to be a bomb dropped on Kyiv, because there might be more partnerships like that and like this. I spoke about the Houthis, I spoke about Iran. Well, we see this a couple of days ago. I was meant to talk about it then, but I just delayed it for this video. The Russian rocket takes Iranian satellites into orbit as ties grow closer. So it took 2 into orbit, a Kawsar, which is a high-resolution imaging satellite, and the Hodhod, which is a small communication satellite. And this growing cooperation between Moscow and Tehran. Now, this is what I speak about with these red lines, with the escalation, is it's not just within Ukraine, it's things like this, that now Tehran may have access to high-resolution satellite imaging and communications, what increases their capability. Exactly like we've spoken about with North Korea, and we know exactly the weapon system. Which weapon system does Russia have the most of in the world that they use all the time as a use of coercion and influence? Starts with an N. Which countries are the ones trying to seek that the most? One starts with an NK and one starts with an I. Now, I'm not saying that Russia is going to hand over that tech, but the threat is definitely there, and it's something that America has to consider. If Iran was to gain the technology of that system, it levels influence in the Middle East strategically, not conventionally, strategically. If North Korea was able to gain that technology, it levels the peninsula there strategically, not conventionally, but strategically, absolutely. So, like I say, and people are coming to the realization, if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, Russia would not have invaded Ukraine. This is where I'm saying Australia should become a sovereign state, should become a republic, and should gain nuclear weapons just as the largest hammer that you can have and go fuck off. If Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, the way the US would have responded to this war would have been significantly different. This is the unfairness of nuclear weapons, is the major nuclear powers who have the ability to have just worldwide devastation can operate on another level around the world. Is this unfair? Yes. Is it the way of the world? Yes. I have a mate who's 6'4", 140 kilos and a national level, not UFC, MMA fighter. Can he have a different attitude walking around than I? Yeah. It may not be fair, but it's the way of the world. I'm 5'6" and can't fight for shit. So let's have a look at what Putin had at a speech here. And this lines up with some of what we spoke about yesterday, I believe, too. There comes in a way a moment of truth. The former world arrangement is irreversibly passing away. We hear Putin talk about this, that it's the end of the unipolar world. We've got America at the top and everyone else has nowhere near the power, that it's becoming more of a multipolar world. Actually, it's already passed away, and a serious, irreconcilable struggle is unfolding for the development of a new world order, the multipolar world. It is irreconcilable above all because this is not even a fight for power or geopolitical influence. It's a clash of the very principles that will underlie the relations of countries and peoples at the historical stage. Its outcome will determine whether we will be able, through joint efforts, to build a world that will allow all nations to develop and resolve emerging contradictions based on mutual respect for cultures and civilizations. Now, this is what we spoke about. Putin, of course, doesn't tweet. He doesn't write bloody on Twitter or books or this or that. So to actually get about how he looks at the world, you need to read some of these. And also, I've been reading a lot of Dugan, because if Dugan has the influence on Putin that Ukraine says that he does because they went after to assassinate him, it's important to look at maybe how Dugan sees the world and maybe how that can influence or is maybe in line with Putin's. And this is what we see in like his theory of the multipolar world, is this idea of the mutual respect between civilizations rather than sovereign nations, but that you're going to have different civilizations at the heads here, because he says sovereign nations at the moment with the military power, you're just not going to compete unless you're part of some sort of larger alliance. And this is where both of them are saying that the time of the unipolar world is decreasing and that other polls are increasing. And of course, the one leading that the most, or Russia would like to think it's them, it's not at all, is China and India. At first glance, it may appear that there is no alternative. Yet, regrettably, there is. It is the dive of humanity into the depths of aggressive anarchy, internal and external splits, and the erosion of traditional values, the emergency of new forms of tyranny, and the actual renunciation of the classical principles of democracy, along with fundamental rights and freedoms. Increasingly often, democracy is being interpreted not as the rule of the majority, but of minority. Traditional democracy and the rule of the people are being set against an abstract notion of freedom, the sake of which some argue democratic procedures, elections, majority opinion, freedom of speech, and unbiased media can be disregarded or sacrificed. In the book, The Fourth Political Theory by Dugan, he speaks about this, around democracy appealing to how a minority may see rather than the majority. This is exactly what I think we've seen actually unfold in America, and why the polls were all wrong, and why a lot of the EU is freaking out now. And what I believe he means, I've put in some brackets here. This is what I believe Putin means in this paragraph, is that the compromise of democracy, you're compromising democracy to feel more free and to show freedoms, but you're compromising maybe the traditional areas of this and where you're appealing to in those democratic processes. That is what I believe, and that striving for freedom, the society might enable new forms of control and tyranny. This is what Dugan and Putin both allude to through bits of this. That this is less about the rule of the majority and more about accommodating to minority interests. And I believe this is exactly why I believe that Kamala lost, and why we're seeing a shift in Europe also. So that's very similar. It's very interesting to read something that Dugan says and then see Putin sort of just reword it in a way around multipolar worlds, or just speaking of traditional values or whatever. I'd love to know what the relationship actually is there, whether it's just like an advisor, whether they're good mates. I don't really know, and you will never really know. But that's why it's important not to just pay off all of that, because you're like, well, if this guy is influential, I want to know what he's fucking influencing, not just pay it off of, oh, he's crazy. No, listen to it, because I think that what Russia is seeing is not just this war. They're seeing this as their way to become more powerful all around the world, not just here. I think the biggest threat the West sees is the development of a new ideology away from that. The biggest thing to ever threaten democracy and liberal democracy and liberal capitalism was not an individual nation, it's ideological. Ideologies are incredibly powerful. And if Russia and maybe and other nations can have, well, that's the Soviet Union, of course, under communism, was such a threat. Nazi Germany under fascism. It's why it's such a threat, these ideologies. Now, those were defeated, but if there can be something else developed, this is why I believe that people see Dugan as one of the most dangerous characters in the world, and the fourth political theory, all of that. This is important to know, because otherwise you'll pay this off as Putin just wants to take Zap City. Okay, yes, maybe, but why? And how does he see the future here? Also, the peril lies in the imposition of totalitarian ideologies and making them the norm, as exemplified by the current Western liberalism. This is exactly why I said it is not clear to me why Putin would want Trump in, who goes against so much of this liberalism, rather than Kamala, who, of course, what we see, like his critique up here, they are appealing to minority interest or accommodating to minority interest over majority and being more liberal for where I see Russia thinking their future is and wanting to pave that way. I see that Trump puts the brakes on that a lot more than Harris. I don't know. This modern Western liberalism, in my view, has degenerated into extreme intolerance and aggression towards any alternative or sovereign and independent thought. Today, it seeks to justify neo-Nazism, terrorism, racism, and even the mass genocide of civilians. And what I've said is religion and ideology, don't listen to my spelling there, but religion and ideology make sane and rational people do wicked actions. You can look at religion in basically general, just at different time frames, or you can look at something like communism, that wicked and humane actions by a massive amount of sane and rational people. The leaders in Nazi Germany, yeah, they may have been insane, irrational, crazy, but it doesn't mean that all the Germans were, and look what happened there. Religion and ideology can make sane, rational, normal people do insane, crazy things. And this is the bullshit idea. This is shared mostly, I see, by like socialist, Marxist sort of people, is this cost of ideology of, well, that is what it costs us. That to have communism, to have socialism, to have X, Y, and Z, the cost is going to be tens of billions of lives. That's what I see people really put forward. They have this view of a utopia, and the cost to get to it they're willing to make, even if it's in the tens of millions. Moreover, there are international conflicts and confrontations fraught with the danger of mutual destruction. Weapons that can cause this do exist, those nuclear weapons, and are being constantly improved, taking new forms as technologies advance. The number of nations possessing such weapons is growing, and no one can guarantee that these weapons will not be used. Russia has the most amount of deliverable nuclear weapons in the world. China's developing theirs, America's developing theirs, other countries are developing, and there could be a share of technology to other nations also. Ukraine has alluded to the potential of them looking to develop nuclear weapons. We know North Korea and Iran, they want to have nuclear weapons. I think by the 22nd century, we will see the number of nuclear weapons in the world to a factor of 10. Especially if threats incrementally multiply and legal and moral norms are ultimately shattered. So this is a bit of a threat, a bit of coercion here, but it is interesting to look at. I've previously stated that we have reached red lines. The West calls to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia, a nation with the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. This is the problem about a strategic defeat on Russia, why it'd be so interesting to look back on this war in 10 years, and sadly, I'm probably not going to make it. But that the West was like supporting Ukraine enough at points to defend themselves, but never to have like a strategic defeat on Russia, because there was always this fear of, well, what does that look like? Like, what happens if Ukraine does inflict such damage on the Russian economy, on the Russian military, and this and that? Do they fall back into Moscow and recuperate for 50 years? Or if it is a threat to the continuation of the Russian Federation, is that button pushed? We don't know. Is it if we're going out, we're taking everyone with us? Instead of recognising the futility of their ambitions and the objective nature of change, certain Western elites seem poised to go to any lengths to thwart the development of a new international system that aligns with the interests of the global majority. Of course, talking population numbers here. In the recent policies of the US and its allies, for instance, the principle of you shall not belong to anyone, or you're either with us or against us, has become increasingly evident. Now, this is speaking about the economic potential of BRICS and the large population of BRICS also. And what we hear a lot of non-Western countries saying is you can't have this attitude anymore of the West and the rest, because the rest are becoming far more powerful and far more cohesive as well. And the fight of the 21st century, whether with guns or not, will be the fight over the global South. Chaos, a systemic crisis, is already escalating in the very nations that attempt to implement such strategies. The pursuit of exclusivity, liberal and globalist messianism, and ideological military and political monopoly is steadily depleting those countries that pursue these paths, pushing the world towards decline and starkly contradicting the genuine interests of the people in the US and European countries. Going back to that he spoke about the majority and minority and things moving forward. But with this is why I don't believe, if Putin sees that this increases their influence around the world, why then he wanted Trump. I don't believe they did want Trump. Maybe for the war in Ukraine they did, but for the larger unipolar, multipolar, what they think is moving, I can't see. I think Trump put the brakes on that, and I think many people see it the same way. that he's putting the brakes on this move to like woke liberalism, even in the US, even if they're not concerned at all with Russia. And I think that Russia saw that being the malignancy that would reduce America's international influence and countries wanting to work with the US either. If he believes that liberal globalist ideas weaken, why would he want the more nationalist Trump? In this context, I want to emphasise once more, unlike our counterparts, Russia does not view Western civilization as an adversary, nor does it pose a question of us or them. I reiterate, you're either one of us or against us is not part of our vocabulary. We have no desire to teach anyone or impose our worldview upon anyone. Our stance is open and it is as follows. So this is an interesting part to look at beyond face value. As well, that's bullshit because we can see that Russia does view that they are at a war with the West at the moment. But this is interesting to see, like I said, that war over the global South and other nations and influence there, the different ways that both Russia and the West are trying to gain influence through what is being named as Rus colonialism or soft imperialism, and you can change those in and out. So basically, the way Russia is getting influence in all of these places is on the promise of sovereignty, but it's also working with groups or governments or whatever that we won't work with. A great example of this is the reason everything failed in Afghanistan was ultimately we tried to instill democracy in Afghanistan. The will obviously wasn't there, and that all then fell apart. Now, we are not going to work with the Taliban. We're not going to do that. What Russia is stepping into in countries like Afghanistan or countries in Africa or across Asia is stepping in and they're like, we don't give a shit who's in power. Or if you want us to run a coup to put X in power, we want your oil or gas or gold. We want you to buy our this or that. So it's this promise of sovereignty working with governments or leaders that we won't work with, and this promise of sovereignty, and you don't have to change any way, we just want to do trade, why Russia is having a lot of success in places where we went in for this soft imperialism of we will withhold relationships due to separating ideologies. We're not going to work with the Taliban because we see the pinnacle of capitalist democracy and the freedom that brings and the peace that brings. But we won't work with a country that lacks democracy or lacks human rights. So it's like, well, if you want trade with us, you have to have, human rights, move towards democracy, this or that. But there's nations that don't want that. Maybe the will of the people may want it, but maybe the government does, that the Russians will work with them and that we won't. Look at North Korea. We're never going to work with North Korea, regardless of what they would have. But Russia will. Look at Iran, look at Afghanistan, a lot of nations like this, particularly in Africa. And these are both ways of gaining global influence, but it seems like Russia has sort of no rules on who they'll work with. If they've got any anti-West rhetoric or anything they want, they'll work with it regardless of human rights abuses or whatever, where we are putting no, it has to be within this. That's a very interesting piece that will become more relevant through this century or maybe into the next, depending how slowly or quickly this moves. The West has indeed amassed significant human, intellectual, cultural and material resources which enable it to thrive as one of the key elements of the global system. However, it is precisely one of, alongside rapidly advancing nations and groups. Hegemony, so in this context mean like dominance in the new international order, is not a consideration. There won't be dominance by one state or one group. So it won't be dominant by the South or the West or whatever. There will be, this is Dugan and Putin, this is where the similarities overlap in that like Venn diagram of ideas around there won't be dominance by one power. There's multiple poles of very similar powers. And that is interesting. It is interesting to see where that lines up. I've been trying to my best I can educate myself on how does Putin, who's launched this war, who holds this massive arsenal of nuclear weapons, where does he see the world in X amount of years? And I think the best way is probably actually through Dugan, to read his stuff. One thing I will say is I'm actually very surprised how critical he is in some of his written text about Putin and the Kremlin too. And of course, the other pole, or the two other poles that this is greatly ignoring. is China and Islam. That is something we haven't spoken about today in this, and where those alliances sit and who will work with X, Y, and Z, and growing influence around the world too. And like the icebreakers we spoke about too, that as Asia becomes more developed, eating more meat, more grain, Russia's a huge exporter of that, more electricity, more oil, more gas being used, Russia's doing this, and could we be reducing some of our influence because we're trying to move to more green energy that's more expensive, it's maybe appealing to maybe more of a minority, or we're not willing to work with a nation that could help each other because of ideological reasons. I'm not saying that therefore we should be working, I'm just saying that we're cutting off a lot of who we could work with. It's a very interesting thing, and I think the battle for the global south, or battle for the third or second world, I'm not meaning with guns, I'm meaning with like influence, is going to be the story of this century, with that changing or at least leveling of global influence between nations. If China doesn't have a population collapse, we'll definitely be at that. If India can sort of get its shit together as far as industry and technology, that too, America will always be up there, just always will be, but where will other alliances sit, and who will maybe be swung? Who are like the swing states here? That Australia and America and the UK and Germany, they're always going to be on one side. But there are swing states in this too that will become increasingly important for trade, for influence, for development of industry, for development of technology, everything. Sorry, Legends, this one was long. Look after yourselves, and I'll speak to you very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.